afternoon. Just to warn you, I'm not actually going to provide a step-by-step tutorial on how to hack a presidential election, but I chose this title because I wanted to keep in mind different ways of thinking about hacking and different ways of thinking about election fraud. It is going to focus mostly on the American case just because of the current circumstances. But as I hope you'll see, there are things that we can keep in mind in Canada and in other countries as well that use different electoral systems. So this is an example of a voting machine, an electronic voting machine that you might have in the United States. So in 2008, this particular model, the Sequoia AVC Edge, was used in 161 jurisdictions, which represent a combined total of about 9 million voters. And it's since been updated, and one of the reasons, and you'll see on the next screen, this is the same model of voting machine that was, after a few Princeton researchers had their way with it and turned it into a Pac-Man console. So what they did is they removed screws, they opened up the casing, removed the memory card, reformatted it, reprogrammed it, put it back in. You could play Pac-Man on the voting machine. And these machines even come with like little tamper-proof seals so you can tell if somebody's tried to crack into it. And the way they did it, they just took the whole thing apart and the seals stayed intact. So if you looked at it from first glance, you wouldn't be able to tell that anything was wrong with it until it started playing Pac-Man. So the question is, what is a bigger risk to the electoral system? Something like this or something like this? And I'm going to argue that something like this is actually more complicated and probably a bigger priority because there will always be breaches, there will always be opportunities for manipulation of data. But a bigger problem is if you have a, let's say, for example, a candidate of a leading party who is telling his supporters that the election doesn't matter and it's rigged against them and their votes don't count. That sort of questions the integrity of the entire system, and it can undermine confidence in an institution of democracy. And that's something that is going to be harder to fix. So just to give you a brief overview, when I speak about hacking, I'm speaking about it in a very broad sense. But there's mostly two categories that I would put it into. One is dealing with the voting itself, and this is the system of counting votes and casting ballots. And then one is more broadly, the electoral system and things that are associated with it. And so I'm going to explain a little bit about both of these, and then some notes about ways that we can potentially mitigate these problems. So we all remember what happened in 2000 with the Bush versus Gore election, the notorious hanging chads in Florida. So after that, the United States brought in new legislation. It's called the Help America Vote Act. It was passed in 2002. And one of the things it did is it gave different local election authorities funding to update their voting machines. It also created the Election Assistance Commission, which helps facilitate votes, and it tests systems and does research and makes recommendations. The important thing to keep in mind is that this is not a central election authority. In the United States, voting is a state issue. So election rules and technology vary from state to state, and also sometimes from precinct to precinct within the states. A lot of the machines that were purchased in 2002 were the kind of touchscreen device that we saw earlier. And the idea was that it would be more accessible for people to be able to vote. But the problem is this kind of machine is called a direct recording electronic machine. And so what that means is when you enter your vote into the screen, it goes directly into the system, and there's no paper trail and there's no physical record. So if something is wrong with the numbers once they're in the machine, there's no way to double check that against any kind of paper trail. So this is more and more election authorities are noticing that this is a problem. They're being phased out, but this is still the kind of machine that's being used in primarily 5 states, I believe, right now. The voting machines themselves are not connected to the internet, but in some cases there's administration machines that will program them, and those might be. So they are vulnerable to hacking in that way. But as we saw with our Pac-Man example, it doesn't matter if a machine isn't connected to the internet because you can still get in there with a voting cartridge, or you can reprogram things. A lot of times these machines are in storage for a long period of time, or they're left out overnight at a school or a church hall or wherever the voting venue is. So it is possible for people to access them. And the other thing is that many of these machines, once they got funding in 2002, haven't been updated since then, because elections are really seen as a very politically appetizing expenditure for a lot of people. So there is the Brennan Center for Justice, which studies this, found that there are actually some voting machines in Georgia that are still running Windows 2000, and so there's no security patches available for those anymore. The good thing about not having a central election authority is that it's difficult for somebody to single-handedly come in and influence the results of an entire election nationwide. But if it was a tight race and you were able to mess with the results of one state or even one tight precinct in a state, that could make a difference. And it could also undermine confidence in the rest of the results. Thank you. But there are also other ways that I'm going to call more of a procedural or an election process hacking. And this is where countries like Canada pay attention, because we might not have voting machines, but we do have local election offices, let's say, that are keeping voter registration lists. So, for example, this summer in Arizona and Illinois, hackers were able to compromise voter registration databases. In Illinois, they stole the personal data of 200,000 voters. And this information is valuable for a couple of reasons. One is that if you have the email addresses and the phone numbers of people for the other party that you want to beat, you can call them or email them and misdirect them, so send them to a different poll, much like we saw with the robocalls incident here in Canada. The other thing you can do is you can remove that information or delete it. So if people go to the polls to vote, your name's not on the form, it causes a bigger delay. And if there's enough people and enough of a delay, that can actually disenfranchise people, because people won't want to show up to vote if they're waiting in line for 2 hours and if they can't get time off work. Another thing they can do is they can also, local campaign offices have all kinds of data that helps them run their campaigns. So things that are as simple as get out the vote measures. They might have a schedule of who's driving who where. And so things like that, you could just mess with it enough or delete some information, prevent people from coming to the polls. You could also steal donors' information and publish it online, which then can act as a deterrent, and it'll prevent other people from donating to the political party you're trying to defeat. Or as we've seen with the DNC hacks and the hacks of John Podesta, the chair of the Democratic campaign, you can release information that you might be damaging, or you can even manipulate the information and then release it. So it is, even things like that could also be considered a form of hacking. The United States has said that Russia is to blame for the DNC hacks. And even the state voter registration hacks as well, those have been seen as coming from Russia. But those ones, they're not sure if those are state-sponsored activities or if it's just a freelancer who is trying to steal information and then sell it on the dark web. But there is a long history of states interfering in other states' elections. The United States has done this going back to the late 1940s, and both sides definitely made use of this in the Cold War. So what is new is, as in many other cybersecurity issues, the internet just makes it easier to do this from a distance and on a larger scale. So there are difficulties, as with cyber espionage, as with other international cyber attacks, of trying to hold other nations to account. This is something the UN has done with their group of governmental experts, which in a nutshell, they encouraged in 2015 for countries to follow the laws of international law when it comes to not launching cyber attacks on your rivals. And one of their recommendations dealt specifically with critical infrastructure. So states should refrain from attacking other countries' critical infrastructure with cyber attacks. So this is something where it hasn't been specifically spelled out yet, but there is a possibility to include voting machines and elections more generally as part of critical infrastructure. Next slide. So the other thing and the bigger thing is what I mentioned earlier, the idea of building trust. So as long as there are computers involved in the election, whether that's the actual machines to vote or whether that's the machines that are running your databases back in the campaign office, as long as those are there, there's going to be vulnerabilities. So because it's impossible to completely eliminate risk, this is why it's important to try and ensure public trust in elections as a democratic institution. So when there is a breach, the public will believe it has been appropriately corrected. And this is why there's so much concern about the leader of a major party telling his supporters that the election has been rigged. Because if they believe that the system is broken, they may not want to vote. They might not believe in the results. If they say that there has been a hack, but we fixed it, they're not going to believe that either. So the best you can do is to try and make the system as accountable and as transparent as possible. So there are some ways to do this. Auditing is one that's highly recommended. So this is a little bit different than a recount. It's not a full count, but it's more of a statistically significant sample that you can measure against. You can measure the paper ballots against the results from the computers. Just look for any major discrepancies, just to get a sense of the integrity of the system and see if the system itself has been compromised. And it's basically essential for this to have paper ballots or some kind of physical record involved. More states are beginning to require this. At this point, it's still a handful. A lot of them don't, but this is something that a lot of the leading experts are saying should be done. The Department of Homeland Security is also working with local riding offices and local election volunteers, but that is another area where there could be more training. So the poll workers can learn to see if there are anomalies and help to detect them and to mitigate against them. I saw a statistic recently that the average poll worker in the United States is 73 years old. So not to generalize, but this is probably not, in a lot of cases, people who have specific knowledge about IT or about cybersecurity. So even the basic things that some of the speakers mentioned this morning about digital hygiene and just making sure that basic steps are taken and that if there is an attack or if there is something that's a little bit off, you know what to do and you do a bit of a drill. And the other thing is encouraging public oversight. So there are certain procedures in the case of the election that can be open to public oversight. So this is something where election bodies can let people know, we're doing a recount this day. There's this, this procedure that you can witness. You can do a detailed document of the chain of custody. The ballots went here, and then people from each party took them to this counting station, detailed vote breakdowns. Explained how they can access records if they have questions. So again, if they don't believe in the system itself, at least you can give them opportunities to question it, and you can give them opportunities to see what's going on. And hopefully that can at least encourage people to understand that the institution itself is working the way it's supposed to be. So that's it for now. Thank you very much.